Oh, man. This morning when I got up and I was thinking about Bright City and thinking about our church here, the first thing that came to mind was the idea of the tabernacle, God's presence with his people in the wilderness. And that's a temporary thing. They put it up, and then they experience God's presence together. And every week we come together, we build this tent together, we set up shop, and God's presence come and fill this place. And I just feel like God's been here this morning. It's incredible.
Especially this morning, worship was just transcendent. Like, can y'all give a round of applause for our worship team? This morning was so powerful. It was so powerful. But if you are new here, my name is Sharon. This is Ike. We are the pastors here at Bright City Church. And if you are new here, this is actually our second Sunday in the IMAX theater. We were, for most of the life of our church, meeting on the other side in a smaller theater. And just being here in this space is a major provision of God. Because even though we have a lot of room to spread out here, which is really wonderful for COVID, we were getting kind of cramped in that other theater. And so we're really, really thankful to be here in the IMAX.
But be honest if you missed the recliners. Anybody? Yeah. I know there's some parents that don't miss their kids turning on their seat heaters.
Yeah. I mean, I don't miss watching people doze off in the recliners. I don't blame you. I don't judge you. This is a zero judgment zone because I get it. Like, we have 3 children, but at the same time, it's like you're working against the momentum of the recliner. That's right. So, but all that to say, if you're new, we would love to connect with you. And there's a couple ways you can do that. There is a card in your cup holder. If you fill that out, you can drop that in a bucket on your way out. You can also text Bright City to 94000 if you just want to keep it virtual. That will pull up a link tree. You can find that same link tree on our Instagram page. It's Bright City RDU. It's there all week if you want to think about it. But there you can fill out a form to connect. We'll follow up with you. We will send you a gift in the mail. Or if you have been coming for a while and maybe you're ready to get more involved, maybe you're ready to serve, there is also a place on the card that you can fill out to check to get involved as well. But another way that you can connect is immediately after the service. I will be in the lobby. There is a giant pop-up banner that says Next Steps, and I will be standing there just answering any questions you have about who we are, why do we meet in a movie theater, just what we believe, all of that. I'll be standing in the lobby to answer all of those questions for you. And then one last way you can get connected if you are new is that next Sunday after the service, we will be doing something we do every month called Pizza with the Pastor. And we all walk over to California Pizza Kitchen and we have lunch together. And it's a time for you to just spend a little bit more time with me and Ike. I think Alex, our worship pastor, might be there as well. Maybe Eric, who leads our servant leader. He's our servant leader coordinator. So you can get to know some of the leadership of our church as well. So that will be immediately after service next week. So another part of our worship service that we're unfortunately not doing quite yet in person is giving. We talk about giving as an act of worship. And this morning, Ike is actually going to be able to dig into that as part of our wisdom series. But we talk about giving as an act of worship. It's how we tangibly demonstrate the priority of God in our lives. I was thinking as we were worshiping and just thinking about your message this morning that generosity is one of our most honest acts of worship because we're really putting something on the line, And so that's how we think about giving at our church. But there's a couple ways in lieu of the popcorn buckets that you can give, either texting Bright City to 94000, that will pull up a link, or if you go to brightcitychurch.com/give, you can set up automatic monthly giving. So that's pretty much all for this week. But one last thing I wanted you to just have on your radar is we are going to be celebrating our 3rd anniversary later this month, September 26th, I believe. Yeah. So we will be worshiping here, but then we'll be going back to the farm. So those of you who've worshiped there, we love the farm. We'll be having lunch over there. We're really excited. It's kind of hard to believe that we've spent more than half the life of our church in a pandemic. Yeah. Didn't plan that, nope. But God has been so faithful, and so we're really excited to celebrate Him and what He is doing through our church. So September 26th.
Yep, good. Thank you, Sharon. Well, as Sharon said, this morning we're continuing our wisdom series and talking about wisdom and money. But before we do that, for any that were here last week, I just want to give us an opportunity to take a collective sigh together that the SEX talk is over, okay? Can we? Okay, all right. So this morning we're talking about money and wisdom, and Proverbs has a lot to say about money. In fact, there are 100 verses in Proverbs about money, and that's out of 915. So one-tenth of Proverbs is about money and finances. But to get into this morning's talk, I really want you to begin thinking about your relationship to money. And in particular, the role that it plays in your life. How much is your life spent living for money, making money, depending on money, making sure you have enough money? There is a popular show on Netflix right now that has been on, I guess, for a couple years now. And I'm not going to say the name because in case anyone's not listening and all you hear is me say this word or, it gets passed around that I'm using swear words in service. Poops Creek. Okay? The premise of this show is that there's this very wealthy family. They've made a lot of money, but then all of a sudden they lose it all. They lose all of their money, and they lose all of their assets. They lose everything except for this town, Poops Creek, that they had purchased basically as a joke. And so they move into this town and move into this hotel, and basically the series is them figuring out who they are apart from their wealth that they no longer have. And I want you to be thinking this morning, how much does finances dictate your life? How much does it determine your life? How much do you base your identity in the things that you own, the things that you possess, the brands you wear, the size of your house, the car you drive, the latest model of your phone that you have? How much does money dictate, your life, and how much of your life is spent going after money? What I want for you guys this morning is to begin to think about, do I live for something that lasts forever? Because when we're living for money, we are living for something that does not last forever. And so the question is, are you living for something that lasts forever? In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is teaching, and he kind of gives us this idea of how do we know what we're living for? How do we know what we put our value in? And so in Matthew 6:21, he says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What you value is what you're going to give your life to. And so if you want to know what you value, if you want to know what you're concerned about, what you care most about, look at what you give your life to. Look at what you give your attention to, your time to. Look at what stresses you out, what overwhelms you. That's going to tell you what it is that you treasure. And what I want for you this morning is to begin to think about, what does it look like to live for something that lasts forever? For many of us, one of the key things that gets in the way of us living for something that lasts forever is financial questions and concerns and well-being. And so Proverbs this morning, we're going to be looking at what Proverbs tells us about living skillfully in this area, or living with wisdom in this area. Proverbs 23:4-5 says, don't wear yourself out to get rich because you know better. Stop. As soon as your eyes fly to it, it disappears. It makes wings for itself and flies like an eagle to the sky. He's saying, look, you know in your better judgment that this is not worth spending your life going after. But even if that's not enough, the fact that money can go as soon and as fast as it comes should deter you from devoting your life to the pursuit of it. My kids, 6 and 9-year-old boys, love Legos. And there is always some Lego that they have to have. They need it. And so I've gotten to the point where we'll be walking through Lowe's and they'll say, through Target, and they'll say, I need this Lego. And I'm saying, so you're going to die without it? And they're like, well, no. And I'm like, okay, do you really need it, right? But what happens every time that they get this Lego is they buy it, or we buy it for them, one or the other, and then they build it, and then the joy is gone. The satisfaction that it brought is gone. And how often does that happen for us? There's something, man, we just need it. We just got to have it. And then we get it, and it's like, oh, well, that didn't bring the satisfaction that I hoped for. The satisfaction that it brings flies away. It's like it grows wings and flies away. And so when Jesus says in the Gospels that we cannot serve two masters, he names money very specifically because money is the thing that above all other things we are most likely to trust in for our well-being in place of God. It is the thing that we are going to fall into, whether intentionally or accidentally, placing greater trust in than God. And so what I want you to hear this morning is I am not a financial planner. I'm not going to tell you how to grow your 401k, okay? I'm not going to tell you how to invest. What I'm trying to do as a pastor in your life is help you keep from money becoming an idol in your life, something that you are more devoted to than God, something you depend on more than God. I'm becoming more and more convinced that that's our role as pastors, is to help our people prevent from falling into all kinds of idols, meaning something that we worship in place of God. And so if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. I want you to make sure you take this with you. Here is a pivotal truth. You will either use money as a tool to worship God, or you will use God to worship money. God will become the means by which you achieve all of your financial aspirations. And we'll say that it's about God and it's about living righteously, but it's really about how do I get God on my side so that he'll give me what I want. Give me what I think I need. And so again, we end up depending on money versus God. Now, talking about worship here, we're obviously not talking about singing praises to our money. Nobody does that except Scrooge McDuck, okay? We're talking about what you're devoting your life to. Worship is something that you've devoted your life to. And this morning, we're going to talk about how do we avoid devoting our life to money, and how do we concentrate in this area of devoting our lives to God above money. This morning, I want to speak to a couple of assumptions that we make. I want to expose a couple of assumptions that we make about money and finances, and I want to take some time to challenge those, and then offer some insight on how Proverbs talks about living skillfully in this area. And I want to do this by asking 3 questions that you've probably never asked yourself intentionally or out loud, but you live with an assumed answer to this. Okay? So the first question is this: who do I trust to take care of me? Who do I trust to take care of me financially? Who do I trust to provide for my needs to make sure I am well taken care of? For many of us, we've never asked that question, but by default, we operate as if we are responsible for our well-being. That ultimately it all depends on me. And so we fall into this place of self-reliance. And what Proverbs is going to challenge us to do is to shift our dependence from ourselves to God in order to make wise financial decisions. And I'll tell you why that's an important step to take. Because this is the fork in the road. Whether our dependence is on God or our dependence is on ourselves is the fork in the road for the path of wisdom and the path of foolishness. Proverbs tells us that the path of wisdom when it comes to money and finances is, first, it's reliance on God. It's to rely on God. The second step then is the step of seeking provision through diligence and modesty. We're going to talk about both of those in a little bit, but seeking our well-being through diligence and modesty. The third step is then that this diligence with modesty produces space in our lives for generosity. And then generosity produces contentment, and it provides for the poor. That's the path that this path of wisdom takes. The path of foolishness, on the other hand, begins with self-reliance. And on the path of self-reliance or the path of foolishness comes anxiety, comes insecurity. And when provision depends on us, then we will pursue any means necessary to ensure that we have what we need, which means we'll compromise on our integrity. We'll compromise on our character. Because at the end of the day, if it all depends on me, it doesn't matter what I've got to do. I've got to make sure I'm taken care of. And so we'll compromise. The path of foolishness ultimately leads to discontentment because we always need just a little bit more to make sure we're okay. It leads to anxiety. What if I don't have enough? What if something happens and I don't have anything to take care of me? And ultimately, it leads to dishonest practices and ultimately to ruin. And so we've got this choice to make. Are we going to follow the path of God reliance or the path of self-reliance, the path of wisdom or the path of foolishness? The second question that I want to use to expose an assumption that we make is this question: who owns my money? Who owns your money? For many of us, the default answer is, well, of course I do, right? I worked hard for this money. I earned this money. This money is mine, and I will do with it what I want. But when we look at Scripture, the picture that we see is that actually God is the owner and we are the managers. We have a parable that Jesus tells where this master is going on a trip, and so he leaves his funds with 3 of his servants, and he tells them to go and to make more, to invest it, to make more. And so the first one goes and he doubles his money. The second one goes and he doubles his money. But the third one just goes and buries it in the ground because he wants, at least when his master comes back, to give him back what he entrusted to him, to say, I didn't lose any of it. And a lot of times we get caught up in that of like, okay, what are the principles here for how I go and double my money? How do I go and make more money? How do I make sure I'm maximizing the funds that God has given me? And yes, there's a place for stewardship and there's a place for wisdom, but the bigger point is God is the owner and we are the managers. God is the owner and we are the stewards. And what this parable is trying to tell us is if we are not the owners, that means we don't dictate what we do with it. It means that we manage these monies in conformity with the values of the owner. And so how we manage our money should be driven more by God's values as the owner of it than by our desires as the managers. Can you imagine going one day to a financial advisor and saying, hey, I want to invest some money with you guys, and they say, sure, let's get together, let's have a conversation. And so you have a conversation, they get to know you, they want to hear, who you are, your values, what kind of investments you're interested in, kind of all those kind of things. And so you have that conversation, and then a year later you come back and you find out your money is invested in all kinds of things that you did not want it invested in. That dude would be fired. And yet that's often how we view our money of like, well, I'm just going to do what I think is best with it, not realizing that we are managing it for someone else. And this may offend our sensibilities, right? This may offend our sensibilities. I worked hard for this. I made this. But the question is, who gave us the ability to make that income in the first place? Who gave us the opportunities that were presented before us to make that income? We take for granted what's been given to us and then turn around and use it for our own benefit. Going back to the Legos and our kids, a couple of years ago, we bought a Lego and gave it to our oldest child, and he put it together and built it and then turned around and tried to sell it to his brother for $3. I was like, I don't think so, dude. That's not how this works, right? But he took what was given to him and then went and used it for his own gain, his own ends, forgetting that it was a gift to him in the first place. And so my question is, does your management of money reflect your values or God's values as the owner? Finally, the last question to expose an assumption that we make is this: how much money is enough? We've never probably asked that question out loud or intentionally, or maybe we've asked it, in the inside as we make plans, but the answer for most of us is probably just a little bit more. Just a little bit more, then I'd be happy. One more vacation, and then I'd be happy. One more purchase, and then I would be happy. There was a Harvard study done a few years ago that I love this, but they went to people of all economic statuses and asked them what annual salary would be wealth. And so on the whole, those that made $30,000 a year said $60,000 a year would be wealth. That would be enough. Those that make $50,000 on the whole said $100,000 would be enough. Those that made $250,000 a year said $500,000 annually would be enough. That would be wealthy. That would be well off. And those that made $1 million a year said that $5 million would be enough. You would think by the time you got to $1 million, it might be, okay, just a little bit more, but it's 5 times as much. John D. Rockefeller, you may have heard this, John D. Rockefeller, at the height of his power, owned 90% of the oil and gas industry in his day. His wealth was equal to 1% of the U.S. economy I mean, we're talking about one person being the 1%, right? And he was asked by a reporter how much money is enough, and his reply was just a little bit more. We have got to decouple this connection between money and happiness. If for no other reason, it's not true. We see that. We've seen that from others' experiences, maybe from our own experience. Maybe to give you a little bit of perspective, maybe this is helpful, maybe it's not, but $34,000 a year puts you in the top 1% of the world. So how much money is enough? What I want to do is give us a few principles that help us to understand, okay, what does it look like for me to live for something that lasts forever, rather than, immediate things right in front of me when it comes to finances? What does that look like based on the book of Proverbs? How do we live this differently? How do we operate with different assumptions? And so I want to give you 4 kind of principles. I don't know why it is with finances. It's always like, I'm going to give you 4 principles, okay? But I've got a few principles that we get out of Proverbs to help us live this differently, to live with different assumptions. The first principle that I want to give you is what I'm calling the ant principle, like the little ant, the insect. Proverbs 6 says this. It says, "Go to the ant, you slacker, observe its ways and become wise. Without leader, administrator, or ruler, it prepares its provisions in summer. It gathers its food during harvest." This is the idea of diligence. That if you want to take care of yourself financially, the wise way to do it is little by little. It happens with diligence. Proverbs has some harsh things to say about get-quick schemes, about how do I get rich as fast as possible. Most of them end with, it leads to ruin, it leads to poverty, it leads to trouble, it leads to inner turmoil. But when we build it little by little, it has more stability. It also talks about the ants preparing its provisions in summer. Another way that this has been translated is they store up their provisions in summer. And I think one of the things that's happened with this language in Scripture of storing up is that we've bought into this idea that it's to store up as much as possible. Store up as much as you can, but that's not what the Proverbs is saying. It's not saying they store up as much as possible. It says they prepare for what they're going to need. It's preparation. It's not storing up all they have. Jesus in the New Testament had some harsh things to say for a man that stored up all of his wealth. He says he stored up and he built more barns. And at the end of the day, he said, "I have plenty. I can now rest." And it says that very night his life was taken from him. The point is not to store up as much as we can. The point is to prepare. And then to be able to say, okay, this is enough. The image of the ant is a very poignant one. Last week we were out at my mom's house and we were sitting outside around the sidewalk, and over to the left there were 1,000 ants over here. And I was like, what is going on? There wasn't nobody had kicked over an ant hill. I was like, what is happening? And went back to talking. And then a few minutes later, they're all over here. And I'm like, they've moved. And then a few minutes later, they're all over here. And then a few minutes later, they're now heading back home, but they've all got a little chunk of grain with them. And it's just thousands of them working together. And so the other picture that we see with the ants is that the ants are communal. They work together. They take care of one another. They support one another. They work together, but they're diligent, right? It was just one little grain, but they work diligently, a little bit at a time. The second principle is what I'm calling the peace principle. Proverbs 21:17 says this. It says, "The one who loves pleasure will become poor. Whoever loves wine and oil will not get rich." The idea here is that we believe peace or joy or happiness is something out there, and I have to go buy it. That I'll find contentment if I can go and buy this thing. And so the idea behind this is the idea of modesty. The idea that I don't have to have the newest thing, the best thing, the most expensive thing, the biggest house, the newest, nicest car, the nicest brand clothes. The beautiful thing about modesty is it's a way of increasing our financial margin by doing nothing, right? You don't have to go out and work any harder to be modest. It is a simple way of saying, I just don't have to have all the newest, best things in order to be content. But far too many of us, because we've connected money with happiness or the things that we can buy with happiness, believe that peace is something we have to go out there and buy. But when our dependence is on God, when we're God-reliant with our finances, trusting that we will be taken care of, we are set free from the need to prove ourselves through our finances, to manifest our identity and our value to others through our income. And so the peace principle is not about us going and buying peace. It's something that we have when we follow the path of wisdom in God reliance. The third principle is this. It's the root principle. This may be my favorite proverb on money that is in all of this. Proverbs 11:28 says, "Trust in your money and down you go, but the godly flourish like leaves in spring." The image here is of a tree that's dead, falling over, versus a tree that is planted by the river. You know, in Psalms, we have this image of a tree planted by the river whose roots go down into the soil. It taps into another source of water, of life. But he's saying, look, when you trust in money, there's no root system down below to hold you steady, to give you security. And so you can push on that, and it's going to fall right over. And so the question here is the question of what are we depending on for our provision? Now, it's easy to say, just trust God. Just trust God. He's going to take care of you. You would say, that's easy to say. And maybe it's not even true. I mean, we've all been through seasons where we've said, where are you, God? Financially wondering, where is God's provision for us? God, you promised if I depended on you, you would take care of me. And maybe God comes through in a way that we didn't anticipate. But the point here is not to say, just trust God and he's going to give you what money you want. Because at the end of the day, if that's what we're saying, then money is still the thing we're depending on. We're just depending on God to give it to us. And so what's the deeper thing that our roots can tap into, that we can depend on to sustain us, to give us life like the leaves of a tree in spring? Proverbs is saying, when we are living for something that lasts forever, there comes a point at which the immediate and the eternal come into conflict. And if in that moment your confidence is in the immediate thing, it's going to let you down. It's going to let you fall. But if your confidence is in the eternal, it's going to give you life. Now, we're not talking about money here. What we're talking about is our witness to the world. That the world can see us in desperate situations and say, how do you have peace right now? How do you have contentment right now? How are you continuing on right now? The world can't see the roots that are giving us life, but they can see the fruit that it's producing on our limbs. And so the root principle is about ultimately our witness. What is our witness with our finances? Do people look at us as the church, as the people of God, and say, man, they depend on God no more than we do. They're so consumed by depending on their finances that there's virtually no difference between us and them when it comes to our finances, when it comes to desperation. What if the world could look at the people of God and say, I don't know what they have, I don't know what they're tapping into, but man, they endure this a lot better than I do. How do we be a witness when it comes to our finances? And finally, the last principle from Proverbs that I'm giving you is the generosity principle. The generosity principle is that your happiness will depend more on how much you give away than how much you keep for yourself. That your happiness will depend more on how much you give away than how much you keep for yourself. The reason that your happiness will depend more on that is because those who are generous have something that those who need to cling to their finances do not have, which is the freedom from needing more and more. Our generosity is a testament that we don't need it more and more, but we have what we need and we're going to give what we don't need. One of the things that correlates most with generosity is your freedom. the amount of freedom that you feel financially correlates to your generosity. In other words, if you feel a lot of freedom from depending on your finances to sustain you, to take care of you, you're going to feel more freedom to be generous with what you have. If having enough money is not our idol, we're going to be more free to give that in worship of God. Proverbs says this, one person gives freely yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Now, one of the ways that this verse has been used is to say, look, if you just give your money, God's going to give you twice as much back. If you give $5,000, God's going to give you $10,000. And I want you to know that is an abuse of Scripture by pastors, by anyone that's used that to manipulate people. The point here is not how do I give so I can get more. The point is, in our generosity, what's given back to is not necessarily finances, but it's freedom. It's joy, it's contentment, it's life. And that is of greater gain than any amount of money in our bank account. That what refreshes us is not more money. What refreshes us is the Spirit of God renewing us, seeing us, partnering with Him in His work to care for the poor, the needy, to move the kingdom forward. And His Spirit is what is refreshing us. A generous person will be blessed, for he shares his food with the poor. The question of where our dependence lies is going to determine a lot about our lives. It's going to determine our level of contentment. It's going to determine our level of generosity. It's going to determine the level of character that we exercise when it comes to our finances. And so my question for you this morning is, where is your dependence? Are you living for something that's going to last forever, or something that can grow wings and fly away? I want you to live for something that lasts forever, but the truth is, you can't do that as long as you're devoted to things that won't last forever. This is why we can't serve two masters. We're going to be so preoccupied with serving one that we'll neglect the desires and values of the other. And so which master will you choose? The way that you'll know which master you choose is not by what you say with your mouth, what you write down in your journal, what you proclaim. It's what in your heart you know you're depending on. That's what's going to determine your master. And I want you to know that dealing with our finances is not just a practical question, it's a theological question. That if it's about taking care of our well-being, and generosity is giving of ourselves for the well-being of another, we see no greater example of this than Jesus Christ himself, giving fully of his life, laying it all down on the line in order for us to be restored to well-being with God. And so my question for you, what I want you to ponder is, how much does your generosity reflect that you understand the sacrifice that Jesus made? I'm not asking you to give to Bright City. Just give to something, so that you can experience the freedom of saying, okay, maybe I don't need this as desperately as I thought. Are you generous? Will you be generous? Not so that you can get more in return, but so that you can experience the refreshment that comes from being free from the idol of money. Let us pray. God, you have been so clear to us about how deceptive money can be. God, the ways that we have co-opted you into our own financial plans. God, the ways that we have used you to worship money. God, my prayer for our community this morning is that we would be set free. That yes, we may be in difficult financial times right now. In a challenging season, and wondering where it's going to come from. And God, I pray in that we would see it as an opportunity to exercise dependence on you. God, for those of us who maybe are in a season of abundance, God, may we not sit back and think, yes, I have plenty, but might look to the needs of those around us. That the ants, we would depend on one another, that we would care for one another, that we wouldn't go this solo, that we would be generous, that we would be free to be generous. I pray, God, for your church, that your church would witness to a better way, a more free way, a more content way. God, a life that peace doesn't depend on our financial circumstances. God, would you set us free? Would you set us free from that this morning? God, I ask you to work in each person's heart here. We're coming from different places, different experiences, different needs, different desires. God, would your Spirit just move in these people's hearts however it needs to this morning? Speak the words that they need to hear. Teach the lessons that need to be taught. But God, may we be a people that refreshes others, that in turn we may be refreshed by you and by your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.